Hi, everybody. This is Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and you're listening to another episode of Astrologers in Profile. So today's guest is Becca Tarnas. I'm really excited to have Becca here on the show and to be talking with her about her personal journey as an astrologer. The purpose of this show, I started it toward the end of the summer, and the purpose of the show is to hear and share the stories of professional astrologers. I actually came to astrology in a really roundabout way myself. And prior to being in astrological study and practice, I actually was in an MFA program for creative writing. And I studied nonfiction and memoir writing in particular. And so I love story. I love people's stories. And as I've been going through the astrological world, I've noticed how I spend my time and how a lot of us spend our time as astrologers or students of astrology. And that's typically taking in theory, taking in philosophy, taking in charts. And all of that is really good and, endlessly interesting. But sometimes the human side of it gets left out, who we are as people, how we came to astrology, why astrology moves us, why astrology stirs something within, how astrology works in our relationships. Sometimes these stories get left out. So the purpose of this series is really to bring some of those stories to life and to do so from some of our greatest astrologers and sometimes from people you've heard of and sometimes from people you haven't heard of. So hopefully by doing this, it also reminds all of you that astrology isn't just a theoretical discipline. It's also a living story. It's a part of our life. So hopefully this helps it to be recognized by each of you who are listening in your life as well. So with that being said, I'm really excited to welcome Becca to the show today. Becca, so glad to have you here.
Oh, it's so wonderful to be here. Thank you for inviting me. And I love this idea behind the these interviews because story is something that means so much to me. It always has. And telling people stories, that's how we connect at every level to whatever field or discipline we're working in.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, before now I just thought I'm so eager to dive in. I'm going to introduce you first. So Becca Tarnas is a scholar, an artist, and a counseling astrologer. She's the editor of Archive, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology. She received her PhD in philosophy and religion at the California Institute of Integral Studies, just finished her dissertation. Was it last year, Becca?
It was the beginning of this year, actually. I
Oh my
defended in
gosh.
February.
Nice. The dissertation is titled The Back of Beyond, the Red Books of Carl Jung and J.R.R. Tolkien. So Becca came and gave a talk in my seasonal speaker series. We looked into Tolkien's life and his birth chart, and it was totally fascinating. Really excited to talk to you today a little bit at some point about how Tolkien and astrology and Jung and all of this kind of came into your life path. But Becca's first home was in Big Sur, California, and that's always been her place of greatest inspiration, deep love for the natural world, kind of rooted there. She was educated at the San Francisco Waldorf School for 13 years before pursuing environmental studies and theater arts at Mount Holyoke College in Massachusetts. She returned to the Bay Area to get her master's degree in philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness at CIIS. That's the California Institute of Integral Studies, where she co-facilitated the PCC Forum Transdisciplinary Lecture Series with her husband, Matthew Tarnas Siegel, from 2011 to 2015. And Becca's research interests, and otherwise include depth psychology, literature, philosophy, and the ecological imagination. And I have to say that the first time I ever heard of Becca's work, I think I was watching I've told you this before, Becca, but I was watching a Facebook video or a YouTube video or something of Becca giving an amazing talk on the sort of mythology of Lord of the Rings. And it was just so awesome. And you were totally on my radar for a while. And then we finally got to meet and hang out at Norwalk a couple years ago. And so it's really cool to see how all the threads come together. And I'm really excited to talk to you about, your path with astrology today.
I'm delighted to be able to talk about it with you.
Okay, so let's start off with some basic questions. Like there's a place that we all, astrology first comes into our mind or our awareness, and sometimes it's when we're really young, and sometimes it's where people are a lot older. When did astrology first become a thing for you? Do you have a first memory of it?
I actually kind of don't have a first memory of it. So I'm a second generation astrologer. And so I grew up with a father, Richard Tarnas, who's a professional astrologer and researcher. And my mother spoke the language of astrology pretty fluently as well. Mm-hmm. So my birth chart was cast pretty immediately upon my arrival into this world. And so it's one of these things that really just faded into my awareness. But I do know, I think I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and I asked my dad if I could have a reading because he gave readings to other people and I wanted one. And there's a tape recording of this reading, and I don't know where that tape is, but I'm determined to find it. And I just remember sitting up on my parents' bed and the tape recorder's going, and he was explaining what the planetary archetypes were in as gods and goddesses, because I knew myth, I knew Greek myth, I knew Norse myth. And so he was explaining it that way. And I remember as a child being like, okay, but what does that have to do with me? And not quite understanding how they lived through me. But that piece really stuck with me, that these are gods and goddesses. And that's what's in each of our birth charts. So that was kind of my earliest exposure, but it's not something that I pursued as a teenager, or it wasn't anything that was ever imposed on me or that I had to learn. It was more, I heard the language around me.
Right. Right. So that's actually, I've wondered about that because obviously as a parent with 2 girls, I'm thinking of, and I'm an astrologer, I'm thinking to myself, you know, what, I don't want to push obviously astrology on my kids, but they're going to be kind of inundated by it in a sense, just because of my proximity to me and the fact that I do it so much. Did you, obviously, for those who don't know, so Richard Tarnas wrote a book called Cosmos and Psyche, and also Passion of the Western Mind, and was part of pioneering the Cosmology and Consciousness program at CIIS, and well-regarded astrologers. So we're imagining now, as a parent, like I'm trying to imagine what kind of decisions your dad was having to make. Like, I want my kids to know about the, myth and the soul, the spirit, astrology, but I don't want to push it on them. So that's pretty cool that he maintained that balance, because I'm already trying to figure out like what that's going to look like. Do you feel like at times like he was kind of like, I really hope that my daughter is an astrologer, or was he just totally wide open?
I don't think it occurred to him that I would follow this path. And I remember a number of years ago actually listening to a lecture that he gave. I was listening to the recording many years after he gave it. I think it was maybe in like 2004 or something. And he was talking about how one of Jung's children and one of James Hillman's son both became astrologers. And he said that really speaks to something in depth psychology, archetypal psychology, that the children of these pioneers in the field chose to become astrologers. And he said, well, my son is a brilliant software engineer. So he's like, I don't know where I went wrong. And I was in high school at the time that he gave this lecture, listening to it, probably 10 years after it was given. And I thought, wow, that's funny. Like, little did he know. Like, I really don't think it occurred to him that this would be a path I would follow.
Very interesting. So it's in your environment growing up. Was it something that ever annoyed you? Were you ever kind of like, like I mean, like I grew up a preacher's kid, so I was like, would get really sick of like my dad's stuff. You know what I mean? And before I developed a love of it of my own, I guess there were times where I had to rebel from it. Did you ever go through something like that?
I didn't, because it was really kind of inaccessible to me in some ways. And so I knew that my dad was professor and an author. I knew he was an astrologer, but what that meant didn't really click. And the thing that I thought of him most as was a writer,
Hmm.
because from my earliest memories, he was writing. When we lived in Big Sur and then Carmel Valley, he had these separate writing studios, and that were just this world of fascination for me. And so my understanding of what he was doing, he was writing the book. That's what we always called it, the book, but which was Cosmos and Psyche.
Uh-huh.
But again, I didn't really have a sense of the content. When I was 7, I tried to read the opening chapter of Passion of the Western Mind and didn't get very far. And anyone who read that, you'll understand why a 7-year-old didn't get very far with it. Words like epistemology don't really make a lot of sense to you then. So maybe even that early experience of trying to understand it, and it just went over my head. And I'm grateful for that in some ways, because, and I've had this question come up for me too, that you're holding, of how do we introduce this to children? What is the appropriate way to do
Right,
that? And,
right, yeah.
in some ways, maybe it would have been a good thing if I'd been more exposed to it as a child. But from my position now, looking back, I think it was really important that I kind of went on my own journey. And then in some ways, it was a homecoming. And
Right, right.
I was then psychologically and emotionally ready to encounter this work.
That's a very interesting point, because when I think about my own journey with my religious or spiritual faith, there was a homecoming motif. I mean, it's a lot different, but there was a homecoming motif where you kind of go on your own journey and sort of find your way back to the roots. And I'm also thinking about, the ancient astrologers called the fourth house place of parents and family and so forth. They called it the abiding place. And sort of Manilius called it the eternal base of the chart, and the sort of beginning and end of all things. And um, I know that you've, of course, looked at the idea of homecoming a lot. I mean, that's a big theme in Lord of the Rings in some ways too. But at any rate, that just really resonates with me. And I'm wondering if that's part of the daimon that to take something from Hillman like that. There's something unique to the calling of astrology, maybe, that sometimes involves some kind of homecoming, and maybe especially when there is a strong spiritual story or academic story or psychological. I've heard the similar thing. The reason I'm thinking of this is I've heard similar things from children who are parents of therapists, people in academics, religious, so this may be something about that world in general.
Yeah, I think there's something definitely to be said for that. And I didn't go through a major rebellious phase in my teens, for example, although part of me wishes I had. Um, but there was enough of a separation, and that I really had my own strong interests that I was following. I mean, for 10 years, I thought I was going to be an actor. I was going to work in the world of theater. And then I started getting pulled on this path of environmental studies as well, which was initiated by this extraordinary experience working on a biodynamic farm in my late teens. And so,
Okay,
I
we got
mean,
to come back to that, just so you know.
okay. I mean, you wouldn't really think that any of those would be pointing toward astrology or
Mhm.
even a more academic path, which I've clearly landed on. And yet I think in some ways I can feel my own personal recapitulation of like the Western individuation in entering into a kind of, not totally disenchanted, but a kind of, disenchanted individuation in those teenage, early 20s years, and then coming back to a re-enchanted cosmos
Mm.
and recognizing my embeddedness within that, and also recognizing in some way a feeling of being part of a lineage and a family doing this work. So it was a double homecoming for me in that sense, both very personally and cosmically.
Right, right. Yeah. It's it I think it must take one by surprise to find out that one is actually participating in a legacy of that kind, because I mean it's very easy to just think of it as another thing when you grow up with it, like you're around the language, to some extent the lingo is familiar with you, and in some ways it's like, yeah, that's what my parents do, or that's what my dad does, or whatever, and then it becomes your own thing. Well, I want to talk about that. I want to hear about how your homecoming story, or your individuation path, or whatever we want to call it, started taking place. So maybe can you go back? Can you identify some of the first moments that you started going on your own journey, if it's inward and also maybe outward from home, or like where did it get started?
Yeah, I think the place that it got started was this biodynamic farm,
Mm.
because this was my last year of high school. And I'd been to this farm a few times. It's this beautiful biodynamic land that's farmed up in Covelo, California. And biodynamic farming is a method of agriculture that was developed by Rudolf Steiner, who also founded the Waldorf school system, which is what I was educated through from kindergarten through high school in San Francisco. So our school had a connection with this farm. I'd been there a couple times. And at the end of high school, I decided with a close friend to go and do an apprenticeship there for several months.
This is
And
part of the school program, or?
it wasn't. I initially went because we had to do some kind of an internship near the
Oh,
end
okay,
of
gotcha.
high school. So I was out there for 2 weeks. And then in that 2 week period, I felt my life change.
Mm.
And the transits I had at the time, I had double Uranus Pluto transits. And it was this total awakening to the elemental powers of the earth, and being like primally connected to compost and animals. And I was not, if you knew me in high school, I was not the kind of person that you would ever expect this of. And um, I fell so deeply in love with the land and what my body could do there. And I also, probably part of what helps, I fell in love with a person for the first time. And so
That'll.
uh, that romance and being in that place, and we could see the stars. I actually remember that I could see the stars in a way there that I hadn't since, my time spent in Big Sur, where you can also see the stars like they're popping out of the sky.
Wow.
And so somehow that connection to the earth awakened me to a felt sense that we're in an ecological crisis,
Mm.
and a deep understanding of what climate change felt like,
Mm.
because we were working in very high heat in the middle of the summer, like 116 degrees
Oof.
every day for like 2 weeks. And I learned how tough I could be, how hard I could work. Like we're working 13-hour days for 5.5 days a week. And I loved it. And so that I was doing that before I went to college. And then when I went to college, where I thought I would study theater and English, and I chose Mount Holyoke actually for a whole bunch of reasons. It's a women's college on the East Coast, but their English department offered a course on Tolkien. And so I really wanted to pursue that. But by the time I got there, no one was offering it anymore.
Oh no.
And I also realized that English wasn't really my path. I didn't like dissecting stories. I liked living in them.
Mm.
And it would take me a long time to realize why and what that was about. So instead, I decided to double major in theater and environmental studies. And it was that ecological piece, I think, that really set me on the path toward astrology, because I started having these questions come up around worldview, around paradigms, that I was seeing all the details of the crisis around us, but there was no one addressing why our civilization had reached this point, that we were in such disharmony with our home planet. It didn't make sense. No one was answering these questions. And it was in the summer, before my last year of college, and my dad came out to the East Coast to give a lecture. And because he was visiting me, I thought, I'll go and hear him speak. And he presented on, I think it was for a Jung society, and he presented on the evolution of worldviews, basically what he writes about in his first book, Passion of the Western Mind. And suddenly I realized that these big picture questions I've been asking, that so many of the answers were so close to home, that he'd been thinking about this for decades, and I had no idea in some sense. But my own path had brought me back around to that. So I became fascinated with what he had been doing, and I wanted to read his works, and I wanted to know more about the graduate school that he had founded a program in, the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program. So that's really what initiated it.
I see. Wow. So maybe it would be interesting, for the sake of understanding the lineage, if you said something about how your father became interested in these things, or more specifically in astrology and consciousness, because then we might be able to see how the whole trajectory starts kind of fitting together.
Sure. And it's, even though so much of this is his story, I felt very intimately bound up in it. So,
oh yeah, of course.
His story kind of initiates when he decided to go study at Esalen Institute in Big Sur, and Esalen will always be my soul home.
What is let's tell everybody what Esalen is, because not everyone may know.
Esalen Institute is this exquisite land in Big Sur. It's right on the cliffs, that was founded as a center of the human potential movement. And it was founded by Michael Murphy and Dick Price in the 60s. And this is a place that attracted all kinds of teachers from around the world doing work in psychology and psychotherapy and mystical and religious and spiritual traditions and dance and yoga. And it's just massage. It's this plethora of learning. And one of the things that's really special about Esalen is there's these natural hot springs that are there. And so people come and they sit in these healing waters right on the edge of the ocean. And it's one of the most magical places on this planet. Monarch butterflies migrate through there. And I just remember as a kid being there and looking at the trees, and you think at first that there's this orange tree with all these blossoms, and then you realize that it's a eucalyptus completely covered in monarchs.
Oh, wow.
So it's this extraordinary place of learning. And my dad came out there in the early mid 70s to study with Stanislav Grof. And Stan is a pioneering researcher in the field of LSD psychotherapy. He started working with that in Czechoslovakia and in the 50s, and then came out to the States, did research at Johns Hopkins, came out to Esalen. And so when my dad was doing his PhD, he was doing it on LSD psychotherapy, which is actually a direction that his dissertation chair kind of directed him in. He wanted to write on the history of archetypes from Plato to Jung, which he would eventually do. But instead, he went to do this research with Stan on LSD psychotherapy and came out to Esalen to do that. And as they were doing sessions with people, I mean, they were trying everything to figure out, basically to predict what kind of a session someone would have. Because two people on the same day can have extraordinarily different sessions. The same person can have one kind of session one day and then a few weeks later just have a radically different experience. And they tried every psychological test available, and nothing was providing any kind of prediction. Right. And one day a man came through Esalen who suggested to them, he said, have you tried transit astrology? And my dad, being Harvard educated and, coming from his particular background, of course, that had never occurred to him. He held the same skepticism that many people in mainstream academia do. Mm-hmm. But they'd tried everything, and this was Esalen, and
might as well.
So, might as well. And it turned out that looking at the transits, looking at the positions, particularly of the outer planets, to the natal chart, gave a very accurate archetypal prediction of the kind of experience someone would have in an LSD session.
Wow.
And they couldn't believe it. Right. Because, and this is kind of the way they've described it, they had hit upon a method that was even more controversial than the psychedelics themselves.
Right.
So this is what they're bringing together now. They're bringing together psychedelics and astrology. So that's what really went on to inform his whole journey. And he studied, just put in a huge amount of research studying charts and then applying this to world transits and wanting to look at the patterns through history. And this is what he's written about in Cosmos and Psyche. But I'll mention that at the foundation of the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program at CIS, which my dad founded in 1994, it was this work between him and Stan Groff, and they started off teaching a course called Psyche and Cosmos, where they presented this confluence, this intersection between all the understandings that they came to through all the LSD therapeutic sessions and bringing transit astrology into relationship with that.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. And it's really good background for everyone who's meeting you for the first time to know sort of this is the lineage that you're suddenly, like, you're aware it's kind of there, but it makes the story about when you're at school, you're thinking, I'm going to go literature. No, I need to be living a story. And suddenly the things that you're contemplating, you realize, hey, my dad has actually been writing about these things for a long time. And so I have to ask the obligatory question. Had you had a psychedelic experience at all up to this point, or did you have any psychedelic experiences that would be equally important to kind of also bringing you into this whole trajectory of research and cosmology and psyche and everything?
What's extraordinary is I didn't.
Yeah.
I was not drawn in that direction and there was a part of me that wondered why I didn't feel drawn to that. And I think maybe in some way that was part of my rebellion. I grew up knowing that these were realms my dad was really comfortable in. It's funny. I mean, I've known Stan Groff my entire life. And for most of my childhood, I thought of him as the person who did Disney drawings for me.
Right.
Because Stan Groff wanted to be a Disney animator and then went on his own path as a pioneering LSD researcher instead.
Well,
but that was my association.
You're teaching at Pacifica now, right?
Yeah.
There's why can't I remember his name? Oh, I can see if Doug. I can't remember Doug's last name. He's a professor, teaches Jung, and his father was one of the famous 7 Disney animators.
Oh, wow.
So, you know, that is, it's funny how those worlds are actually close. They're not totally, they're not far apart, I guess.
No, and I mean, Disney films have, I mean, if you want to do some really both fun but also profound archetypal analysis and to see the symbolic and the mythic come through, you can see that in an extraordinary way in Disney animations, I think.
Yeah, as we could go on about that. I went down to Florida to, my mom had this medical conference she was attending, and she had a hotel room. And I had some time off. My wife was out of town. So she said, why don't you come down with your daughter and stay in the hotel and you guys can go to Disney World, you know? And I was like, that sounds like fun. So we went, and my daughter and I went back and forth to Disney a few times. My sister came too. And I was blown away by how intensely mythic so many of the memories of, you know, going through the rides that have been there since I was a kid and going back on them. And I was like, well, these are actually really, a lot of them are deeply mythic and also disturbing, like coming around to talking about children and stuff like that. And like reading my daughter Grimm's fairy tales.
They're grim
Yeah, they're
for
grim.
sure.
Holy crap. Like that's like another, you know, other stuff like that. Anyway, it's amazing though how it goes back to that point though about how there's a need even in children for real depth. And then also there's this funny way in which when you're in an environment that's like your caregivers, your parents or whatever are into these deep places, that in some ways that's not what comes out right away. It takes a while to sort of come into the inheritance of that depth tradition. It certainly was like that for me growing up in the church, where it's like, that's what my dad does for a living. You know, it's like, I don't, and a lot of the people who were around in my life too were more casual family friend type of, you know, type of people. It's really interesting. So Stan Groff is amazing sort of LSD research pioneer. Your dad's doing research with him. He's like Uncle Stan. He's like, he's drawing you Disney characters. That's incredible.
Yeah, exactly. It took me a long time to realize uh, who I was actually. I've had a tremendous amount of privilege in terms of the people I've been able to meet, researchers and academics and visionary thinkers through my family. And I recognize that extraordinary privilege. And when you're young, you don't know that. When you're young, they're just people, and of
As
course
they,
they are always still
as
just
they, yeah,
people.
as they should be. Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's the other thing, Becca, that I'm wondering about is at some point after this lecture with you had this lecture with your dad, did it change? Did it start shifting your relationship with your father too at that point?
It did. And the more I got interested in the work he'd been doing, the closer we got emotionally and intellectually as well, and starting to share deep ideas. And that was a big shift between us. And of
Right.
course, I was in my early 20s at that point. So it kind of fit a developmental phase anyway. But yeah, that brought a remarkable change into our relationship and certainly a deepening.
So at some point, this turns into a resurgence of your interest in astrology as well.
Yes. So at this point, I heard that lecture a year before I graduated college. My last year of college, I started dipping a little into astrology. I started reading my dad's book, Cosmos and Psyche. I got a calendar that had my transits mapped out. I didn't yet know how to calculate them myself. I got out of my college library, good for them, Rob Hand's Planets in Transit. And throughout my last year was just kind of tracking that and starting to pick up the technical pieces a little bit. And then after I finished college and I decided to move back to the Bay Area. I was working for this environmental theater company, which was a great job for someone who had double majored in theater environmental studies. And the maybe pivotal decision was because I'd been so interested in this talk that my dad gave a year before. I asked him if I could sit in on his course at CIS, which this is still my favorite course of his that I've ever sat in on. And it was an archetypal history of Western thought.
Hmm.
And so he took the historical narrative that he writes about in The Passion of the Western Mind and taught it through an astrological lens.
So cool. That sounds
it's
really interesting.
it was fascinating because I was basically learning at a very deep level that history of Western thought and looking at the birth chart of all of these different figures. You get to see Descartes' birth chart, and you have the sense of, wow, the person who split mind from matter and basically, is one of the initiators of modernity. It has almost all the planets in like a massive stellium. And you just get the sense that the cosmos chose him for that. And so getting to learn about all these different philosophers and cosmologists and so on through the astrology, that was my introduction to those fields. And also, most importantly, my introduction to this graduate community. Mm-hmm. And I can't overemphasize the degree to which the students in this philosophy, cosmology, and consciousness graduate program were such a huge part of this initiation and journey for me, because every year the program would go on an annual retreat to Esalen and for a week. And I asked, since I was sitting in on the class, if I could come along. I hadn't been to Esalen for a few years. I really missed it. And I thought, I'm a big Sir kid. Like, I thought I would just spend my time on my own, doing my own thing. I would sit in the baths and walk barefoot on the grass. But instead, I did all those things, but this graduate community embraced me. And I started making these close friends. I met the man who would become my husband. And one of the things that struck me was how these students lived this worldview, and how those who were practitioners or students of astrology were so deeply connected to it. And that was a huge inspiration. So in some sense, I got to see this work and even got to see my dad through their eyes. And that was the part of the homecoming that felt almost a little heartbreaking at the same time as it was bringing me to a greater sense of wholeness, because I had this feeling of I didn't know.
I didn't know, right?
Yeah, I didn't know what was here. And the students in this program have become my lifelong friends. Mm-hmm. And that was 8 years ago now. So the role of community has been absolutely huge in that whole journey for me.
It's an interesting thing because, again, it's like there's nothing given about, again, like I'm thinking about my own daughters. I'm just thinking like, they may not really have much of an idea about what I do until they're older, and maybe they will, or maybe they won't take an interest in it or whatever. But it's just such an interesting story to hear, because I think a lot of people would assume when they hear, like they know kind of your lineage or whatever, and they say, well, of course you'd become an astrologer. But it's like, well, not for you. Like, you didn't know that, you know what I mean? And it's like, so there's I love the word heartbreak that you use. That's actually really, really puts me kind of, I can almost see through your eyes what that might have been like at Esalen, kind of experiencing this little bit of a homecoming and feeling like you'd found your place, and not just a place in terms of where your passions were, but in terms of a whole a lineage that you were being brought into. Initiation is a very good word for it. And there's still a door that you had to step through within yourself, even though in some ways, again, people might take it for granted, saying, well, she was just brought up in that environment. Well, no, it was still, you still had to find a way of stepping through that door for yourself. I love that part of your story. I think that's so interesting.
It was a really important part of it for me, because it did feel like I came to it on my own terms, and that it was always a choice for me, that this is where I would be. And in some ways, it's been a painful choice, because in part of those assumptions that it's just handed to you, or you're expected to follow this path. And I've felt that my own process of differentiating who I am as an individual within that lineage has been hard. And there's been a certain amount of, projection I've received around that, and learning to, especially in those earlier years where, I'm in my early 20s and I'm still figuring out who I am, and carrying a certain amount of projection that actually doesn't have anything to do with me, is more based on like my dad and who he is and his work and the projections he gets. And then finding myself in the midst of that. And I think that's always going to be an ongoing process.
Yeah. I mean, I remember similarly growing up and for the longest time being introduced as either the preacher's son or as, well, that's Joe's son. It's my dad. That's Joe's son, because everyone knew who my dad was or whatever, as the church preacher. And so that trying to emerge from the shadow of that, it's really interesting that Jung himself was a preacher's kid. That there does seem to be, sometimes there is a within people who teach or do astrology or in some kind of spiritual path or whatever, sometimes there is something, either it's a lineage or a teacher or a father or mother, that is a vital, like they're part of the gatekeeper, but they also are someone you have to figure out how to step out of the shadow of, and in order to really, as you said, differentiate and kind of find your own voice. And so that's what I want to ask you next is, so this is an initiation moment that's obviously a really important and special one for you. I mean, you're meeting your husband there for the first time. You're kind of finding your space. How do you start becoming your own person within that space from that moment forward? Like, what are some of the markers of where you really start kind of, the light starts spinning off from your unique jewel, like how does that start happening for you?
Well, it's interesting because right around that time, I did try psychedelics for the first time.
I knew it. I was waiting for it. I couldn't. I'm so excited to hear about your trips. I just want to hear about you tripping out. No.
Well, I won't go into the details of the very first experience I had, but it's the kind of first experience that you really hope someone would have. And it was very exquisite and beautiful and simple in some ways. I basically had the experience of turning into a butterfly, and the process of being cocooned and undergoing the dissolution process, and then coming out reformed as a butterfly. And I had this very visceral internal experience of having wings. And for me, that just felt like such a gift of having a symbol of like, this is who you are right now. And that gave me a trust in my own psyche and in these medicines. And so over the next about a year, I was learning the technical side of astrology simultaneously with working with different psychedelics for the first time.
And when you say working with them, I think just so that people understand, you're working with them in a very conscious and intentional manner, I'm guessing. I mean, sometimes there's recreational experiences that everybody has, but you're coming up in a lineage where there's a lot of respect for how these things are used and things like that.
Exactly, like the emphasis on having the right space, having a sitter, having a really safe container so that one can go very deeply into the experience. And because I was learning astrology at the same time, this is the um, the information that was working on me while I was in these experiences. And so I was taking in more and more of the technical material of astrology, and understanding that, you know, the planets are correlated with archetypes.
Mm.
And I knew conceptually what an archetype was, and I knew, you know, all the different keywords that kind of make up what these archetypes are, but it was still a concept.
Mm.
And then, and I've rarely talked about this experience actually, but I've started getting more comfortable speaking about it publicly. There was one experience I had, by far my most powerful to that date, where I was given the gift of an experience of meeting each of the planetary archetypes
Mm.
one at a time. And the experience felt like that they were all so excited I was finally listening, that they all wanted to tell me who they were at once.
Mm.
And I just remember asking, please slow down, please come one at a time so I can actually meet you. And so they each came. The sun, moon, Mercury, like they each introduced themselves, and I had a felt experience of what an archetype is, where all those different words that we use to describe Saturn or Neptune, and where they're kind of refracted into these different terms, I could feel within my whole being how they were unified.
Mm.
And in a sense, who that God was. And the thing that still baffles me, the true mystery of it, is after that experience, that knowing never went away.
Mm. Yeah, right.
And it felt like at that point I had crossed a threshold, and I will never be able to unsee through that archetypal lens.
Mm-hmm.
And I can only express gratitude for
Mm.
that. I don't know why it happened, but I am beyond grateful to have had a mystical experience like that, and that it's informing everything I do from that point onward.
Yeah, right. The I sometimes will have people ask me, who are your teachers? Like who have you studied with? And one of the things that it took me a while to get brave enough to say was, because I was working with ayahuasca for a long time and sort of had a grad school background, so I knew how to be a student, an independent researcher. I was researching everything I could on my own, and then just taking in a lot of these experiences that were helping make what I was studying felt in the body, and understood in a way that really I consider. So really, I consider these medicines, as you said, this to be my teacher, to be my first teacher. In addition to, of course, all of the wonderful. I was reading your dad's book in my first ayahuasca experiences, and I was reading so many others. So, but I find that, nowadays, like Michael Pollan just had a book that came out about the usefulness of, I think it was mushrooms. And um, I first made my way to New York City to be a part of Reality Sandwich and Evolver community, who I know have some really good connections with. There's a lot of people who've come through, have gone out to CIS and stuff like that. So, but I really feel like it's the sort of cutting edge that you see it picking up a little bit more over time. That people are taking it more seriously. These experiences initiate, they teach, they heal. They're so profound, and they make the language of astrology as a psychological tool and as a way of understanding history and ideas, like the ways that you were talking about earlier, as a way of understanding the history of ideas, like that class you're in of your dad's. That I feel like there's more openness to it now than there was when I first got started with all of this. And so I've become a little bit more confident to tell people like, well, my first teacher was this plant medicine or whatever. That's really, really cool and encouraging, I think, to hear other people share their experiences with these things. And especially what you said about once you see something or have an experience like this, you really can't undo what you've seen, and the planets become more than a set of adjectives. They become these kind of living presences that you actually are cultivating a relationship with.
Yeah, it's most definitely like that. This feeling of being in relationship with gods, with these profound beings or presences, and then learning how to live with them and have them live through you. I think we both share a love of that wonderful quote from W.H. Auden that James Hillman likes to repeat. We are lived by powers we pretend to understand.
Yeah.
And that couldn't ring more true with these kinds of experiences. And
Yeah.
we're really just learning how to understand them.
Right. And I think the really important part, and tell me if I'm wrong or tell me if you think differently, is that when it comes to a story about differentiating yourself from the past, becoming your own person, finding your own voice, whether it's, as a preacher's kid or the daughter of a great thinker or whatever, or just anybody who's trying to find their unique voice or something like that. I think sometimes the sort of I want to say the uninitiated story that we're told that's very popular is like, just choose something that you like and then like work really hard at it and like try to carve out a name for yourself as an expert or something like that. And but actually I think when we say we're finding ourselves with these kinds of experiences, they seem to demand that one can only find oneself as one exists in relationship with these kinds of powers. And so in a sense, it's like I'm starting to, when you tell that story, I'm also wondering if it's not the beginning of differentiation where even though it's like, yeah, and someone from a distance could be like, oh, so you had a psychedelic experience where you like got to know the planets. Yeah, but it's a lot deeper than that, because really it's the starting of a sort of multifaceted relationship with your own destiny, with your own, because the planets, in a sense, as you said, are living through us and with us all the time. So the more conscious that relationship is, in a sense, the more that individuating in that sense of who I'm meant to be, it starts emerging through the willingness to have that relationship.
I love how you're putting that. And yeah, I couldn't agree more. I feel like the most important things that I have encountered in my life, or that have come in, or that I'm doing, they all feel like they've found me more than I've made some choice of like, this is what I'm doing next. It's rather the sense of, oh, well, that was already there. And I just needed to reach the point in my own development to recognize that, or to uncover it. And it was like that with astrology. It was like that when I encountered my dissertation topic. And, part of what started driving me on to understand like transpersonal spirituality, for example, was wanting to make sense through this kind of psychological and also religious studies language, what had happened to me, wanting to make sense of that mystical experience in the context of other mystical experiences from other religious traditions. Because I think what can happen is we have an experience like that, and a certain dogma can potentially set in of like, this is the way, this is the lens to see through. And I was fortunate to encounter the work of Jorge Ferrer a little bit past this time, and he's also working in a similar lineage. But he wrote his dissertation, which became his first book. He called it Revisioning Transpersonal Theory, which is, of course, an echo of James Hillman's Revisioning Psychology. And Ferrer is looking at early transpersonal theory as expressed by a number of different people, such as Stan Grof or Ken Wilber or Abraham Maslow, looking at how they're interpreting these kinds of experiences, and then also putting it in the context of how we interpret mystical experiences within other religious traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And the way he approached that was something that really, that was actually the most profound worldview shift for me, was encountering his work and seeing how there's a kind of plurality of religious experiences. And he really emphasizes this idea of participation between the individual human being, or between a religious tradition and what he calls the indefinable mystery.
Mm-hmm.
And or indeterminate mystery, and that these kinds of experiences are a co-creation between that divine mystery and between us and our own incarnated experiences.
I remember reading Revisioning Transpersonal Theory, and then the Participatory Turn, is that the other collection? I think that something like that.
Yeah.
Those books are still some of my favorites. They're so incredible. So yeah, I had similar experiences being in, because I worked in a number of, I grew up in the Christian church, but then I was working in a couple of different ayahuasca traditions from different parts of the world that were different syncretic blends of, Umbanda from Brazil with the Catholicism and the Santo Daime and some Native American traditions that worked their way in with a shaman that I worked with in the United States. And it was just very interesting but trying to make sense of all of it, while also in some ways trying to honor, but also sort of step outside of my Christian upbringing. I found Jorge Ferrer's, his work was just so helpful. So for those out there who are interested in this kind of stuff, transpersonal psychology and cosmology and stuff like mystical experiences, Revisioning Transpersonal Theory is a really cool book for sure. Anyway, that's really cool that you found his work, and it was helping give you some context for these mystical experiences that you were having, and the way that there's a lot of, because even as with astrology, right, astrology and the language of astrology is coming from sort of Greco-Roman tradition, but a psychedelic experience can quickly expose one to archetypal impressions from like all over the world. Like, I don't know if your experiences, but I would be, the depths of the Amazon jungle, having and no exposure to Hinduism, but having really vivid, like, sort of visions of all sorts of sort of Indian, Eastern kinds of imagery and truth that I didn't quite understand, but there was in some ways a foreshadowing of the yogic path that I would walk down. And I think it's like that for a lot of people, where these experiences seem to open up this sort of mystical participatory realm, where each tradition is almost seen as an archetypal dimension of its own that has, it's like a playground or something.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it. These experiences can just open us up to such a diversity of cultural expressions of the divine. And what I appreciate about the perspective that Jorge Ferrer brings is that instead of the more perennialist view of seeing those as kind of stages on a path to like a more hierarchical view,
Right.
that, these are the many faces of the divine, but there's something beyond that we can access that is the right one, or the kind of the deepest truth.
Right.
What I appreciate about his perspective is that, no, these are all equal enactions between us and a divine mystery. And so he breaks down the hierarchy.
Right.
And what I find interesting about bringing astrology into dialogue with that is that it can be situated in that same way as that kind of co-creative enaction, and yet it can also be an interpretive lens for those kinds of experiences. And I know for myself, having the astrological language has provided a structure, like a scaffolding, to put those kinds of experiences on that otherwise can be extraordinarily chaotic or disorienting, or why does this experience follow that one? How are those connected?
Right.
But if you see the archetypes behind it, then you can kind of recognize who is living through that experience, and that we're just a little closer to the realm of the gods in those expanded states of consciousness.
It goes back to what you were saying about how your father and Stan had felt when they stumbled upon the transits as a tool for predict something of the experiences that people would have. They said that this interpretive tool might be even more controversial than, there it is again. It's such a, it's a whole world unto itself that can be overlaid. I think that's why it overlays so easily with so many different religious commitments that people can have. Like, you find, I can't tell you how many people I find coming in for readings that are Christians who are totally in the closet about their love and interest for astrology. But it's because it helps them, it gives an interpretive lens for things that sometimes the Christian language that they're a part of can't totally hold. And sometimes that's not necessarily the fault of Christianity as much as it is their denomination or their preacher or their community or whatever. But the beautiful thing about astrology is that it's really, you see, I mean, Buddhists use astrology, Hindus use astrology, Christians have used astrology, Muslims have used, all the major world religions around the world have had some way of communing with the cosmos. And sometimes it's really in the closet, and other times it's like, it's not. But it seems to me that you're right on in the sense that having that language, and maybe that's something that, that we're on the brink of too, is that there is a potential for, as things become more and more globalized, it's really a uniting language that can dial us into some sense of there being a world soul, which I know is also something that you're really passionate about. Sometimes the world soul, sometimes people call it the anima mundi. Did that start to come around in your experience at all? Because I know up until this point, you're so passionate about the environment and ecology and earth. And how does that start coming back around into, because now we're like at LSD and we're like out in the stars and like all this transpersonal stuff, but you're such an earthy, and you have so much sort of feminine care for the earth and the planet. How does that come back in?
That was definitely a thread that was still running through these experiences. And for me, it felt like the astrological awakening affirmed the sacredness of the earth. And just as astrology looks to the planets out in the solar system, we can look to the planet that we live upon, which really is, to quote my dad, it's a moving center of meaning. And that we have this extraordinary gift to be living on this planet, that this planet has brought us to life. So I see that as very intimately interconnected, the astrological and the ecological, and that the recognition of divine patterning that astrology can open us up to can also give us a sense of that same sacredness with this earth. And there's a reason we're here, and there's a reason that one of the first things I do actually when I start an astrology reading is I'll orient the client to what they're looking at with the birth chart and point out that that line that cuts out across horizontally is the horizon line. And I want them to imagine that line extending as the curvature of the earth, and that astrology is only possible from being based upon the earth. Mm-hmm. So that's part of how I've held them in interconnection.
Kind of comes back to that. Yeah. It goes back to another thing you were saying, which is the importance of this kind of participatory relational model. How do we interact with the divine in relationship? And I think that's really, really important, because the scaffolding toward, all world religions, and then kind of building some kind of scaffolding toward enlightenment and all of that sort of hierarchical model. I think one of the reasons that I think I've very naturally found my way to Bhakti yoga for a very similar reason, which is that in Bhakti, it really sort of cuts out the idea of the ambitiousness of the spiritual pursuit, and instead emphasizes that the sort of highest yogic state, the union state, is imagined as a reciprocal loving exchange, a kind of participatory and reciprocal dynamic. And that's been so appealing to me. One thing that I wonder about is, in the midst of what we're talking about, is, and this is kind of just a philosophical tangent, but I'm curious to get your take on this, is that, so let's say that these ideas about participating with the divine mystery, this is really important, but some of the key features that I'm seeing in your path that facilitate that, or that awaken that, and that likely would, I imagine, keep it at the center of your life, like a fire that you're constantly stoking, is community, and also ritual, and returning to those community and ritual spaces to sort of invoke our connection to one another, and to invoke the relational dynamic that we have. And those things must be still important to you today. Yeah. And also my secondary question is, how do you think that those things can be available to people en masse without necessarily saying, like, this is the religion, or whatever?
I think that community piece is so important at so many levels. Being able to hold space for each other, to go through really profound experiences. I think of it, community in some ways, like a really healthy community is like holding together the solar and lunar archetypes. Like, you have the lunar matrix and container and interrelationality and caretaking and nurturing, so that each individual within that community can come into their solar identity and have that be celebrated, and they can each shine without the sense of eclipsing anyone else. And that, I feel, is like really the heart of a healthy community, is being able to do that, and being able to share a diversity and plurality of ideas. Indeed, I actually think that's really essential to it, that there are many perspectives being held together within community, and what holds it together are more bonds of love and communion and care. But when there's a plurality of ideas, rather than everyone having the exact same perspective, that's when you get those fruitful dialogues. And one of the things I've so loved about this graduate community I've been a part of is those long late night conversations where you just go down these deep philosophical, spiritual rabbit holes of conversation, and learn so much. I mean, I have learned as much, if not more, from my community and my peers than any book I've read, and my individual experiences have been so held within that, that I can't separate them out.
And do you think that there's a need for more of that in the greater world, better spiritual communities that hold this kind of diversity and some some intentional ritual kinds of activities? Is that something that um, do you think that there's, yeah, and do you think that there needs to be more of that right now?
I do think that, and I often speak to people around the world who are really longing for that. And it's like, um, having a community that's oriented around a graduate program or a training or, a school of thought or, spiritual tradition. There's something ready made about that, but not everyone has that kind of thing that they're drawn to. And yet we're such communal creatures as human beings. And I think there is such a loneliness and a longing for depth in, certainly in this country, but I think in many places all around the world, that longing. And, part of that's I'm not sure how that can better be initiated. Like if you don't have a community already to connect to or something that you're drawn into that can help form that. I'm not totally sure what would be the spark, but I do know just from my own experiences how absolutely essential that has been. And I almost wonder if it's, there's a bit of like a risk taking or a leap in forming that. So when we work with controversial things such as psychedelics or astrology, or we have spontaneous mystical experiences, there's not a lot in the contemporary mainstream culture that supports that, supports that as more than just a drug experience, or you've gone crazy, or you're into some kind of...
You're going through a hippie phase or...
Exactly.
Right.
But what that does is it makes it so we're less likely to risk sharing these parts of ourselves. But the more people I speak to, the more I get the sense that that is within most people. And that if that spark can be ignited in taking that risk and sharing some of those deeper innermost experiences, it can allow someone else to say, I've had that too. I'm thinking of like Rupert Sheldrake, for example, when he'll speak to scientists about his research, which is, of course, very controversial within the mainstream scientific community, because he's talking about kind of paranormal things and morphic fields and so on. And then, the whole audience will be kind of dismissive of what he's saying. And then after he's spoken, one by one, each of the scientists will come up to him and say, I've had that experience, but I can't tell my colleagues. And
Right.
and then each one does that.
Right.
He's like, do you all know you've had these experiences, but you're not sharing them? And I feel like that's the edge we're at culturally. Like, just share it.
Yeah.
Just say you've had an experience like that. Maybe you haven't had an experience like that since you were a child. But it's there. There's something deeper in each of us. And I think it's connecting in those places around imagination, around dreams, around visionary experiences, whatever it looks like. That's what can help bring together those kinds of trusting communities.
Sure. So kind of going back to your timeline a little bit, you're in graduate school. You're now starting to study cosmology and consciousness and philosophy. You've had psychedelic experiences. The importance of the environment is still a really big deal for you. Are you starting to take clients? Are you starting to, where are your astrological studies going at this point?
At that point, so I was in graduate school for a really long time, 2 years doing a master's and then 5 years doing a PhD.
Right.
And I wasn't seeing clients for quite a few years there in the beginning, and would kind of slowly, my practice started slowly, like a reading for a friend here, reading for a family member here. It started off more with family members because it's just maybe a safer container. You're not charging anything. And really, I started getting my feet there. And I come from a very large family, lots of aunts, uncles, cousins. And so my practice in that sense was developing in terms of seeing clients kind of slowly growing. And I wasn't putting too much emphasis on that because I was so busy with school. And in terms of learning, there was a certain amount of book learning that I was doing, but a lot of my research was really taking in, again, through these non-ordinary states of consciousness, and then studying the charts of artists and musicians and actors and the arts that inspire me. I've always been so drawn to the arts in my life, and I love music, and I love great films, and of course storytelling. So that's really where I started deepening my astrological research and it never felt like work. It's just this, you want to know, you see someone perform and you want to know their chart. So it's doing astrological research has always felt a little different to me than any other kind of learning or research, because it's just always there. It's always kind of bodying forth. Yeah.
Yeah, it has a weird way of because the sky is always moving and always facilitating opportunities to, kind of hear the music of the spheres. You can dial into it just about any time, and it's a really unique that if you start studying astrology, sort of life becomes the classroom in this funny way.
Absolutely. Yeah. You have this full laboratory of your family and friends and heroes and so forth, it's an infinite study.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about, I want to hear about how Tolkien and Jung and, how did this start forming in how did your interest in these particular topics start showing up?
It's funny because that, in some ways, it feels like it's an unrelated thread to the astrological piece, except that they overlap in terms of the symbolic. I think they overlap in terms of worldview, paradigm, even if they seemingly are kind of separate subjects. Tolkien's writings and the world of Middle Earth has been a part of my life since I was 9 years old. And in some ways, I consider that my earliest and deepest love. And so I've told this story a number of times that when I was 9, my fourth grade teacher read us The Hobbit. And I had this experience of feeling like this world, these names, this story even, I already knew them. There was something that felt deeply, almost like primally familiar about Middle Earth. And I read The Lord of the Rings when I was 13 and just dropped into this world. And in some ways, something that's kind of comparable, just with the experience that I had where it felt like crossing a veil and encountering each of the planetary archetypes as gods or as beings. From the time that I first read The Lord of the Rings and really deeply in my teenage years, I felt like I was almost on the other side of a veil in terms of Tolkien's stories. This is something that, while people knew I loved these stories, was really kept pretty private because, everyone else around me, my friends, they'd read these books and like, yeah, that's great. And then they moved on. And I was like, but I can't leave this
I
place.
can't move on. I gotta stay here. This is so cool.
So it saturated my imagination. And in the same way that I see through an astrological lens, it was like I saw through this lens of an imaginal world. And in some ways felt like I was living a dual life, like living a life as a high school student and living a life where
Moonlighting as a hobbit, basically.
well, moonlighting as an elf.
There we go.
I was, there was a part of me in those years that like so deeply wanted to just be an elf and like be in Middle Earth. And I almost couldn't understand why I had to be here in this contemporary time where there's cars and planes and like noise and machines. And it didn't make sense to me.
See, that's actually where the really nice part about your lineage came in, because your dad and LSD saved you from becoming a live action role player. That's what actually we're saying right now. You could have gone down the Dungeons and Dragons path, but
I'm teaching a course now on the Lord of the Rings, and I know that a number of people those are paths that they've gone down, and it's really deeply meaningful for them. And it's not something I've been drawn to. In some ways, I've felt a certain distance from any like fan expressions of,
I know you,
like I can't do the costumes. I can't do, that's just not how it works for me.
no, good. Yeah, thank you.
And like if that's something someone is drawn to, that's wonderful for them. But
maybe it's not though. Maybe no, I'm just kidding.
But I guess in part because of that, I've kept my love of Tolkien until more recently very private. And this was my inner world, my imaginal world. This was like a deep magic and wisdom for me, but not something that was really to be expressed externally.
You were in the closet about Tolkien.
Pretty much, yeah. And I didn't have people I could share this with, which was very lonely. Because if I did meet someone who had that same kind of love or knowledge, it was directed more toward like an external love and expression of that. And that's not what I was meant to do. And so then when I was already in graduate school at CIS, I started taking classes from Jacob Sherman, who is an extraordinary scholar of religion and imagination and philosophy. His area of expertise is like medieval Christianity, but honestly, this man knows something about everything. And he awakened my imagination in a way that no teacher had before. And I took every class I possibly could with him. And I think it was the first class I took with him was called The Creative Imagination. And he traced our understanding of what the imagination is through philosophy and through history. An extraordinary class, going from Plato and Aristotle through Ficino. And right at the end of the class, he assigned us Tolkien's essay on fairy stories. And this is, Tolkien didn't write a lot of essays, and this is hands down his best one, where he lays out his philosophy of imagination and his theory of what he called subcreation, which is really how one can create a world or discover a world in the imagination. And that he really saw it as the divine creativity of God being channeled through the human imagination and creativity. That's why he calls it subcreation, because it's creation under God. And this class, and especially reading that essay, was revolutionary for me, because all at the same moment, I found a teacher and a perspective where I could embrace fully this love and knowledge of Tolkien's works that had been a part of me, for a decade and a half at that point, and take a scholarly route with it and basically deepen into it in a way that met who I was, what my proclivities were, my orientation. And that was life-changing. Yeah.
So I have to ask, because this is just a simple I'm a fan of Lord of the Rings, obviously, and The Hobbit. And my question is, if you have a favorite part of the series from Hobbit through Return of the King, like if there's a favorite, so that's question one. And question two is if there's any scene or, kind of particular part of the story that has been really important to you somehow in your development as an astrologer, has just been really personally important to you.
Mm. I love those questions. Um, favorite scene. I mean,
there's so many, I know, but
there's so many. Can I name two?
Yeah, two is fine. Two is allowable.
I'm trying to go to the place where I'm like, what makes me cry the most? And the two that come forward are the scene in The Return of the King, the chapter, The Battle of the Pelennor Fields, where Eowyn, the shield maiden of the Rohirrim, who's disguised herself as a man, encounters the Lord of the Nazgul, the Witch King of Angmar, and there's been this prophecy that he will not fall by the hand of man. And of course, when you read Tolkien, as anything up until basically the 80s, humanity is referred to as man. And you have, elves and men. You have the men of Gondor, the men of Rohan, the men of the West. And it's just assumed that encompasses men and women, encompasses mortal human beings. And so in this encounter, the Lord of the Nazgul says, "No man may hinder me." And she laughs and she says, "But I am a woman. No man am I. You look upon a woman." And just the extraordinary twist that is there, that it's the patriarchal language and even culture that's obscured her identity, that's kept her feeling caged, trapped, hopeless, suicidal, and yet it's also her shield and then the fulfillment of her destiny. And I feel like we can almost Tolkien published The Lord of the Rings in the mid-1950s. It's like, that's such a symbolic moment of woman breaking out of that label man and saying, no, I am my own person.
Beautiful.
And I'm gonna
right.
end you. So it's just so moving and satisfying and clever too. Mm-hmm. And even a kind of remarkable seeing through on Tolkien's part, seeing through how language obscures women in that way, and yet that can be the means of their breaking out.
Yeah. That's brilliant. That's so brilliant. Okay, but you said you have two, so I want to hear the other one, because you tell it just almost better than reading it. So
oh, I can never tell it better than reading it, but I've read it so many times, I've internalized it. The other one is near the end of The Two Towers, in the chapter, The Stairs of Cirith Ungol. And it's when Frodo and Sam are resting on the stairs. Gollum has disappeared for a bit, and they're on the edge of hell, basically. And they're talking about wondering what kind of story they've landed in. And they just can't see the end. They don't know how it will turn out. They know they're in the seemingly the darkest, most hellish part. Little do they know it's going to get so much worse. But they can feel that. They can sense it. And Sam starts thinking about the stories that he grew up hearing. And, that this character, Beren, he was in this, much worse place. And then he suddenly realizes that story that he's recalling from his childhood, that the themes within it have been carried right down to that moment. And the connection piece for him is that the light within the star glass that Frodo has is the light that's captured from the star Erendil, and that star is the Silmaril, which is what Beren retrieved. So he's realizing in that moment that they're part of the same story. He's like, don't the great stories never end? And so their recognition that they are within a story, and they say, what it'll be like if Um, will our story be read out of a great book with black and red letters by the fireside? And of course, that's what's happening right then, because as the reader, we're sitting there with that great book with black and red letters, and the story has already been told. And so it's this self-reflexive moment where you both feel the separation of the story, where the characters are kind of breaking out and recognizing they're not just characters, that they're part of this, and you're holding the book, and you kind of get pulled in as well because you're holding it.
Right.
um,
Right.
and it's this extraordinary kind of self-reflexive turn. And in some ways, that recognition of being in the story, even when we're in the darkest part of it, is what can give us the strength to go on, because we don't know what the ending is. And I actually think that's extremely applicable to our current moment, where the world feels so heavy and so morally dark, and yet we're in the middle of a great story and we don't know how it's going to end. And as Sam says, the great stories don't ever end. So that's my other favorite part.
Beautiful. Those are takes me back, makes me want to revisit the books, especially. It's been a while. I think the last time that I read through the entire trilogy was when the movies were first coming out. So it's
It
been
has been a while.
yeah. So it's been a while. I need to revisit. But I read the entire Narnia Chronicles to my daughter when she was in the womb,
Oh,
and I'm very excited to. My father read me those books when I was a kid, The Lord of the Rings, when I was, I don't remember, 7, 8 or something, started reading to me. And yeah, I mean, that's definitely one of my cheesy dad goals, is to to read The Lord of the Rings to my kids. So yeah,
oh,
that
that's
just made me more
wonderful.
excited. And I also think what you said about the piece about being in the story, there's a homecoming in that reflexive moment as well, of realizing that you're a part of the continuation of a story. And um, I like that something that was so important to you when you were in a space that was not yet sort of cognizant of dad's lineage and the astrology and Stan Groff and CIS, and that this part of you is very private and intimate, and sort of your a sacred well. Um, in fact, one of the things you said was that there was a deep magic. I think that was what I heard you say, and I'm reminded of the the is it Galadriel that takes them to the pool that they look into?
Yeah, the Mirror of Galadriel.
The Mirror of Galadriel. And she was talking about the elves and that, and I'm just thinking about how astrology is sort of like a mirror of Galadriel. It has this like mirroring, cosmic sort of mirroring power, and it's very. I'm so just fascinated by that image of you kind of in this private, deep magic space with Lord of the Rings being internalized so deeply in you, and yet that would be one of the key things that would become a part of your differentiation. So it's not like it's not like a, well, there was, Becca, before I knew about my participation in this legacy that I was born into, and then I kind of woke up to it and sort of find, but it's this piece of you that was blossoming, kind of privately while all this other stuff was going on. That would actually be a critical part to your dissertation work, to everything that you would become very passionate about. That symbolic world would tie to the cosmological studies that you were doing. That to me is my favorite part of your story so far, because it's clearly the piece of you that you bring so much passion and love for. And I think, to me, one of the things that is sort of underrated is the importance of private spaces in our lives where we are a little embarrassed to be really deeply obsessed and in love with something. You know what I mean? Like, I love those
Absolutely.
spaces.
Absolutely. And for sure, Middle Earth was that for me for so long. And I even reached a point, actually, probably right before I encountered astrology, where I was like, it's probably time to set this aside. It's probably time to let go of this childhood fascination with this story,
Right.
because I just had no one to share it with, and it didn't make sense. And yeah, and yet it has become this kind of key to my own path. And when I decided I wanted to write a PhD, I knew that I wanted to work with this teacher I mentioned, Jacob Sherman. I probably wouldn't have written a PhD if I hadn't had him as a teacher. And I knew I wanted it to be on Tolkien and the imagination. And again, it was like pure synchronicity and chance, chance in a divine sense, that I encountered Carl Jung's Red Book. And something clicked for me in looking at Jung's Red Book. And because I saw through this lens of the Tolkienian Middle Earth, and I saw the Red Book, I thought, this is something out of Tolkien's world.
Right.
And then that kind of blasted open this recognition that Tolkien's world wasn't just Tolkien's world. It
Right.
was an unimaginable world, and many people have been there.
Right. That's really a key insight. So maybe what you could do for us right now, everyone who's listening, is tell us a little bit about I mean, you're going to give a talk on this eventually for Nightlight. We've hopefully got that on the calendar, but
We definitely do.
yeah. So tell us a little bit about Jung's Red Book, and a little bit more explicitly about how the connection is made between his work and the Red Book in particular in Middle Earth.
Sure. So Jung's Red Book is this beautiful, massive text that Carl Jung, one of the founders of depth psychology, created out of experiences that he had that first began as visionary experiences. So starting in 1913, Jung had a spontaneous visionary experience. He was on a train and he saw a flood overtake all of Europe in this vision. And it was a flood that turned to blood. And he thought that perhaps he just had a psychotic break. He thought he was going crazy, and he, was working as a psychiatrist. He's working with schizophrenic patients. He knows what this looks like, and he's pretty sure he's being pulled on that descent. But he managed to hold both the experience and the part of him that wanted to understand what that experience was. And so he courageously delved deeper. And through that, he employed the practice of what he called active imagination, which actually has a very long lineage in Gnosticism and alchemy and Neoplatonism. And active imagination is essentially the process of meditating with images. You hold an image in your mind, or an emotion even, that then turns into an image. And inevitably, this is kind of the mystery of it, it begins to move and you can step into it. And he called these fantasies, active fantasies. And so the Red Book is a record of the experiences that Jung had over a several year period from 1913 really to 1917 was the visionary period, where night after night he's going into these active fantasies and then writing them down. And then he transcribed them into this big, beautiful red book with black and red letters. I mean, there's the echo with Tolkien right there to begin with, that records these stories of what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. And he wrote it out in this beautiful calligraphic script. He illustrated it with these exquisite illustrations. And he worked on this all the way until 1930 before he set it aside, in part because he felt like no one's going to understand this. No one is going to understand the experiences behind it. And so he then set about translating what his experiences were into his psychology. And really what he encountered, what that gets translated into, are like what we think of now as the Jungian psychological archetypes. But he's meeting them as persons. And so
a little bit like the psychedelic space that you were in, he's having an embodied kind of experience of these figures, these archetypes.
Exactly. And active imagination is, although one isn't having it mediated by any kind of medicine or a substance, it's very much comparable, maybe a little more work, less surrender. But for Jung, he didn't need that mediation. Like he was pulled very fully and forcefully even into this realm. And it was terrifying for him.
Mm-hmm.
But he maintained a grip on his sanity and on certain things in his external world that let him continue to make these deep dives. And that's the experience at the back of his psychology, which is extraordinary. And the Red Book wasn't published until 2009. So it's this critical piece of Jung's life work, in some ways like one of the initiating seeds of it. And yet the world didn't have access to it until less than 10 years ago.
I was in New York City when it came to the Rubin, and the Rubin was like a couple blocks from my apartment. So I remember it very, very well. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, and I mean, here's another kind of funny thing is that um, I something when I first heard about the Red Book being published, something kind of clicked for me. I knew nothing at this point in 2009 about, or almost nothing about Jung, except that he was someone whose work my dad was interested in. And so the Red Book's pretty expensive. So I got in touch with my brother and I was like, hey, let's go in on this really expensive book for our dad as a birthday gift. Having no idea that this is what I would end up writing my dissertation about.
There it is again.
Yeah. So, and then the piece with the connection between the two Red Books in the context of the Lord of the Rings, that story is written out in a great book with black and red letters, and it's called The Red Book of Westmarch. And Tolkien presents himself simply as the translator of that work rather than the author of a story. He's translating a record of the War of the Ring, basically. And so within the story itself, it's called the Red Book. And that's what sparked the connection for me. I was like, there's a Red Book and a Red Book. And then
yeah,
they
totally.
look similar.
Like, I gotta go into that. That's, yeah. It's a funny thing how there's something that an image that's coming to my mind as you're speaking, which is the image of the way that the ring is found at one point, which is sort of by if I remember correctly, it's sort of by mistake. It's sort of like happenstance that someone comes across the ring. What I'm thinking of is just that there's a funny way in which the work that we're meant to do in the world, the work that we're meant to do, it has a way when it appears of being this shimmering, shining thing that sort of grabs our attention, but it eventually also becomes a spiritual weight that we're bearing in some ways in some ways it takes us away from some level of childlike innocence or childlike preoccupations or whatever. And so I think the other thing that I'm thinking about is how the Lord of the Rings has probably become something that has evolved. It's not just the childhood magical world that you had in private, but it's something eventually that there's that glimmer between the red books and the psychedelic experiences, and you end up ends up being a great work of your life, really, because dissertations aren't easy to write, and like all of this, it becomes something that you yourself sort of you become a ring bearer in a sense.
Oh, I love that. That parallel between the finding of the ring and how we find what it is we're meant to do. And there's actually two instances of that finding of the ring by chance. And when Tolkien uses the word chance, he never means chance. He really means divine.
The right time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So just stumbling across it in the dark or in a river and picking it up by chance. So it's the thing is with writing a dissertation, and I'll say this is it was the hardest thing I've ever done, because it is essentially writing a book. And the deep love that I have for Tolkien's work and have developed for Jung's Red Book, although that was much more challenging to develop a love. And in some ways, I feel like by viewing it through the Tolkienian lens, that almost protected me from Jung's Red Book for the first several readings through, because I was already intentionally reading through that Tolkienian viewpoint. If I had just read Jung's Red Book without more of an orientation, I think it would have been a lot. I don't think I would have written about it, first of all. I don't think I would have even liked it. And having now just this past summer taught a course at Pacifica on Jung's Red Book, I realized how important that dual lens was for me to go deeply into Jung, and how now for myself as a teacher, I almost want to be able to provide that container and like symbolic buffer for people entering into it, because the experience Jung went through was extraordinary and terrifying, and it does things to you when you read it. So that deep love of Tolkien in some ways protected me, I think, in the relationship with Jung's work, and also sustained me, because you have to have a passion for your subject to get through a dissertation, because it is such a trial. And I am eternally grateful that I found a subject, or a subject found me, that I could fall in love with as deeply as any romance.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I have a story about the Red Book. I'll tell it some other time. I've told it to you before, but it's a long story, so I'll save it. But
it's a great story, Phil.
It's a powerful text, and it works on you and it weighs on you. And I think what you said about having a buffer or having a container, and that's where astrology comes back in again, because during both this period, I'm guessing you're obviously also making connections between their birth charts and between your own birth chart as you're going through this. You are undergoing the trial or tribulation and initiation of writing a dissertation. You're tracking your own transits. You're looking at their transits. So it again, astrology becomes such a unique sort of simultaneous interpretive lens for the entire thing. I'm guessing that was your experience, yeah?
It was my experience. And the interesting thing is, I was definitely doing that. I thought I would have a whole chapter in my dissertation on the astrology of the two Red Books, and I even wrote it. And somewhere along the way, I realized that that was not meant to be part of the story. It was meant to inform my symbolic eye, and yet I couldn't actually include it.
That's good. What strikes when you say that, the first thing that I think of is there's back to my thing about the importance of privacy, and to have something that you love that's kept quiet or private. There's that line from the Gospels where Jesus is saying, "Don't be like the hypocrites who pray on the streets for everyone to see, but instead pray in the secret." Sort of, you know, in a private, secluded kind of prayer space. And I always have thought of that in as a creative person as well, that it's really important that we not try to. Sometimes astrology can be used in a way that's really nice, like making an overt connection, like here's how all the pieces fit together throughout the whole thing. This is where the outer planets were, and this is that, and it's just like ties this like ribbon around it. But it's like Sam says in Lord of the Rings, as you were mentioning, like these stories never end. And in order for the idea for us to not tie anything up too nicely, to keep something private, to keep something unexplained, to keep something perpetual. That I think oftentimes in that becomes the seed ground for something else, some next iteration of creative work or whatever. So I'm always really relieved to hear people, artists or whatever, say that they feel like something was left out or not everything got in, or I couldn't find a place for this or that. I'm always like, oh, good, like it's that probably very meaningful way of taking. There's something more to carry forward then.
Yeah, it's looking at the astrology in relation to Jung and Tolkien, and the fact that one of the key pieces here is a parallel in timing, that at the same time Jung started his Red Book experiences in 1913, Tolkien was doing these extraordinary imaginal drawings that he recorded in a book that he called the Book of Ishnis. And they track each other on the exact same years, basically, for those early experiences. And you can totally see it reflected in the transits, that the world transits and their personal transits. And yet what I realized was that I had to, that was like a meta-narrative lens, and it provides a certain context of meaning, but the parallels that I was seeing between the two red books were so specific at times, like the same images, similar composition sometimes, the same way of describing a place or a scene. And I found dozens upon dozens upon dozens of these. This is what the whole content of my dissertation is tracing out all of these parallels. And I basically realized that while astrology let me zoom out to a bigger symbolic container, I needed to go into the specifics, and that those specific parallels were telling me something else, something maybe a little closer to home. Mm-hmm. And that's what opened up this whole kind of understanding of what I refer to as the imaginal realm. This realm that we enter into through the imagination, that, again, kind of applying that participatory perspective, is a place where the archetypal and the particular intersect, and that co-creates a world that looks like fairy, like Middle Earth, and has these particular figures come forth with their very specific descriptions. Why is it that Tolkien and Jung are both writing about an old man with white hair and beard, and who is a kind of magician wizard, and that has this kind of guiding role? I mean, that's just one example. And we can say, okay, that's the Jungian archetype of the wise old man, but they're describing him very similar, accurate language. So likewise, we can be like, oh, that's the Saturnian figure. But it's also more than just Saturn. I mean, right. Gandalf has all these other qualities too. And
right. And what happens to Gandalf? What happens to the actual image and the actual relationship when we revert it back to Saturn, or, whatever? I think that's one of the things I loved about Hillman so much, is his sort of advocacy of the particular, and the archetype needs the particular.
Because otherwise we can fall into this kind of archetypal reductionism. Right. And you can see that happen with Jungian psychology, and you can see it happen with astrology even. We can even do it to our own experiences, where we say, oh, well, that's just my Saturn-Neptune transit. Right. And then we almost bypass the particular event that's happening in our lives because we recognize that larger context. Right. I mean, there's always that potential to fall into the shadow side in either direction.
Right. Yeah, I'm very passionate about that, as we've talked about this before. But for example, sometimes people will say, I study Hellenistic astrology, right? So it's ancient Greek astrology. People will say, oh, just traditional astrology, it's so Saturnine. Or, they'll have a way of kind of dismissing it as an archetype, and also, people might say, so it's like some kind of esoteric astrology. Oh, it's so Neptunian. Or, they'll kind of flippantly, or even will use the language to also reduce entire worlds, basically, or into psychological descriptions that make us comfortable. Some gives us some comfortable reflective distance. For example, I had a student of mine who is sort of secretly studying astrology, while this is actually not, I've had a lot of clients like this actually, but so, who's secretly studying astrology while in the Christian world. And one of the things that this individual was doing was really kind of working out, trying to get distance from the Christian world by using the language of astrology to say, well, the Christian world is like this. It's like Saturn, or it's like Saturn Pluto, or it's like, and it was always in terms of archetypes that helped express her dislike for the tradition. And one of the things that I did with this person was, in our sessions, we worked on trying to find different elements of the tradition that embodied different archetypes. Like what about communion? What about the poinsettias at Christmas, or the lilies at Easter, the altar? What about Venus? Where's Venus in the sanctuary? Like, because I think one of the things we also need to do is help bring the archetypes, rather taking the particular and zooming out to the archetype, taking the archetype and bringing it into the particular.
Absolutely. It's such a dance, right? It's like, if we start off learning all the particulars and topics and word lists, and then, have a unifying experience where we see the archetypes in their wholeness, the part of seeing them in their wholeness is recognizing that wholeness is made of an infinity of particulars.
Right.
And just moving back. I mean, isn't that so much of the whole history of philosophy, is just how do we hold together the universal and the particular?
Right.
Which
Yeah,
is
exactly. And for those who, we were talking earlier about Becca's dad's book, The Passion of the Western Mind. And that book, probably more than any other, helped me get a grasp on Western philosophy, basically from a standpoint of the dialectical between those two. And if people ever feel like, gosh, I was taking a Western philosophy class or something like that at college, and you're like, gosh, it seems like they're just having the same conversations in different ways over and over. Well, actually, yeah. So, and
that's exactly what they're doing.
That's exactly what they're doing. That's kind of what your dad's book is about.
And you know what I love about that is that that's such an invitation to keep having the conversations and to keep asking the questions, because the big lesson that I've taken from that, the fact that paradigms exist, that they liberate us, and then we grow into them and fill them out until they're too constraining, and then we have to be born into a new one, is that even as we're in what feels like a fruitful moment within our own paradigm, to know that too will come to an end. At some point, what we feel is most liberating will become constraining. And that I think that can help in undercutting any kind of dogma that we may have the desire to fall into.
Yeah, that's very, very nicely said. Well, we are just about at the point where we need to start wrapping up. I want to ask you a few last sort of big questions, right now, what are you doing? You finished your dissertation. What are you doing right now? How is astrology a part of your life right now?
Astrology has come very center stage in my life. After I finished my dissertation and graduated, I quit my job as a program coordinator, and I'm now giving readings full time, which is such an amazing thing to get to do. I mean, every space with a client is unique because each client is unique. So I'm still kind of in awe that this is what I'm getting to do with my life.
That's pretty cool.
And then I'm teaching. I'm teaching as an adjunct professor at Pacifica Graduate Institute. I taught there this summer. I'll be teaching there next summer on Jung's Red Book and active imagination. And then I've also been working with Neuro Learning, this wonderful online learning platform founded by Jeremy Johnson. And so this fall, I've been teaching a course on the Lord of the Rings it's a non-academic course, deep dive into the story. And I feel like I'm getting to say things that I've been waiting 20 years to say, to share with people. I'm doing a course with them again in the spring on the Silmarillion, which is Tolkien's kind of early first and second age mythology. And then again, we'll be doing the Lord of the Rings course the following fall. So my life has really kind of become this expression of the astrological, the Tolkienian, and also the Jungian, at least through active imagination. And I feel so blessed that I get to do this and share it with people who are interested in that.
That's very cool. Yeah, it's a really cool mix of things, and you're a really cool person, Becca. I'm really glad that you could be here today and share with us your passion and your intelligence and just everything that you bring and the story. And especially, it's not an easy thing. In some ways, it would. Again, I think one of my favorite parts of your story is that being born into an astrological legacy, one would think, oh, I became an astrologer because that's just like what I was taught or whatever. But you really found it in your own way. You came to it in your own way. Your own inner imaginative spiritual place with Lord of the Rings has come to bear on your career. I just love your story. It's a really great story. And if I'm thinking about being a dad and being an astrologer and just thinking, gosh, whatever my girls do is cool with me, but I'm sure your father couldn't have been more pleasantly surprised and proud of who you've become and what you're doing and the way you're developing your own gifts and qualities to the world.
Well, he kindly has said as much, and it's wonderful when you get to be recognized by your parents in that way. So I feel really blessed with that. And in terms of your own children, the thing that was so inspiring for me was just getting to see it lived, rather than having it presented to me, but rather just seeing it in the world. And I think if for either of your children that's the path for them, then they'll follow it.
That's brilliant. It's brilliant advice. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share your website, which people can now see. You can see this is beccatarnas.com. And when you scroll down, you can see a recent talk that she gave, some blog stuff. You can go to the astrological counseling tab to check out more about her counseling. There's podcast videos, there's painting, there's writing, there's where you can see her take her classes. There's a lot of stuff you can check out here. And Becca is also the current editor of Archive, the Journal of Archetypal Cosmology. And you have a new issue coming out, right?
Yeah, I've been working on the 7th issue of Archive, and I'm planning to bring it out right at the end of this year. So there's a lot actually of Jungian themes in this particular issue, Jungian and historical themes. So I'm really excited to be sharing that. I co-edit the journal with Grant Maxwell, and right now the way we're doing it is we're alternating issues. So we worked together on issue 5, which is all about Saturn. So if you want to deep dive into Saturn,
it was great. I really liked it.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, that was quite an homage to Saturn that we did, and we got permission to reprint James Hillman's amazing essay on Sun X consciousness in that one. So that kind of created the backbone for it. And then Grant did issue 6, and I'm now working on issue 7.
Nice. Very cool. Is there anything else that people should check out or stay aware of? Anything that you've got coming up?
Well, if you are interested in Tolkien, I will be offering this course in the spring on the Silmarillion, deep dive into that world. And I'm always putting new things up on my events page. I'm traveling to a number of different places. If you're in Europe, I'm teaching an introductory course, a short course on archetypal astrology in Belgium in mid-April. So if you're over there, that might be a really fun thing to attend. And a lot of things I'm doing are online, so they're easily accessible through my events page on my website.
Awesome. Yeah, and Becca's going to be back. She already gave a talk with us on Tolkien and his astrology, and is coming back to do something on Jung and the Red Book, and then maybe even a third installment on the crossover between the two.
That'll be really fun to offer.
Yeah,
And thank
yeah.
you for hosting the platform.
Yeah, totally. This has been so much fun. I'm really excited to continue collaborating with you. And I'm again, just to reiterate for everyone listening today, this is our, in a sense, all of us that love astrology, this is our heritage, are these rich stories. And we all have them, and we all come to astrology in interesting ways. And the way that astrology weaves into the different interests that we have in life is also, to me, really interesting. And that was easily my favorite part of story that you told today, Becca, was just hearing how so many different interests that you have sort of all found a way together in astrology. So the cosmos can hold all of it. It's pretty impressive.
Indeed, it can. And, one of the things too is I've now been engaging with astrology really actively for 8 years, but I also feel like such a student, just kind of on the edge of learning so much more. And that's something else I've been really excited about since finishing my PhD, is wanting to take in so many more perspectives and techniques. And because I've been working within one lineage primarily, and of archetypal astrology. And as you know, I've been wanting to broaden that, and I'm finally creating the space in my life to be able to do that. So I have a tremendous amount to learn from yourself and from others who are teaching in these fields.
It's an exciting thing to be a student of astrology, and I think probably, well, for the rest of my life, I couldn't imagine ever reaching a point where I didn't feel like I was still a student too. So I'm right there with you, and we all have learned a lot from you today as well. So this is where we will end. I hope that you will all stay tuned for another episode. I do one a month, so there'll be another one in December. And I'm going to keep that, I'll keep that a mystery for you. You'll have to stay tuned. I'm in the process of confirming with someone, but I don't have it confirmed yet, so I can't say for sure. But thank you, everybody, for listening. And I hope that you all have a very beautiful holiday season and solstice, winter solstice coming up here if you're in the Northern Hemisphere. Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.